Well, guys, it is great to see you. It's great being with every single one of you and experiencing our live services, regardless if you're in the room or if you're watching or listening online. I just want you to know it is awesome that we get to be together, and it is awesome just to be with you guys. So I want to welcome you because today we're going to keep this conversation going that we started last week in this brand new series called Brick by Brick. And if you weren't here last week, I want to give you a little bit of context to why we're doing this series and really what this whole thing is about. And so last week we started this whole conversation, and I said there's a Bible verse that I read that I think is so relevant for all of us. And really, regardless if you're a Christian or not, regardless if you're Democrat, Republican, independent, libertarian, birthday partier, Kanye West kind of party, regardless where you're at on the political spectrum, I think all of us would go like, yep, this is absolutely true. And here's a verse. It's found in Proverbs 28. And here's what the author says. He says, but a nation will be strong and endure when it has intelligent, sensible leaders. And I think we read that, and I think regardless where you're at, Christian or not, I think you go, yep, giddy up. That's exactly right. And I think this is what we desire. I mean, we desire strength. We desire endurance as a nation. But the author makes it very clear that that strength and endurance and that something better hinges on leadership. And the reason I think that's important is because I think the same thing is true for your life. I think the same thing is true for my life. In fact, I think we could take Proverbs chapter 28 and we could kind of turn it into our own words, and we could say this, but a marriage will be strong and endure when it has intelligent, sensible leadership. Or you could say, but a faith will be strong and endure when it has intelligent, sensible leadership. Or you could say, but a career will be strong and endure when it has intelligent, sensible leadership. And we could keep going and going. I mean, we could say, but a family will be strong and endure. And parenting and our lives will be strong and endure. But it hinges on intelligent and sensible leadership. Leadership is so incredibly important. In fact, that's exactly what John Maxwell, who's a leadership guru, and we talked about this last week, but John Maxwell sold over 20 million books. He's a New York Times bestseller. He's been around leadership for decades and decades and decades, and he's been on the other side of some of the greatest leaders in our world. And one of his primary observations he makes about leadership, about your life and my life, is this, is think about this. Everything rises and falls on leadership. That's a gigantic statement. And then he goes on and says, when it comes to leadership, leadership is simply influence. Nothing more, nothing less. And every single one of us in our lives, we have influence. You have influence with your son, with your daughter, with your wife, with your husband, boyfriend, girlfriend, on social media, with your friends at school, in your neighborhood, extended family. Every single one of us have influence. And here's the really good news, is that we can actually grow our influence. That's not something like fun to say or trying to make people feel good. Like, it's legit. The thing we can all do that's real is every single one of us can take a step and grow our influence. And if we grow our influence, as the proverb says, it leads to strength, it leads to endurance. So the question becomes, how do we grow influence? What does that even look like? How do we take a practical step into that? Well, guys, this is the whole series that we're doing, and this is the why behind the what. And so we're taking one brick at a time. And last week we took our first brick, and we said this brick of how to grow our influence is foundational. This brick gives us clarity behind the why, or gives us the why. This gives us clarity of what to say no to and what to say yes to. This gives us clarity and motivation to continue on when obstacles come our way. And so if you weren't here last week, what we talked about in this first brick, I want you to go online, and I want you to listen to what we said and how we described this first brick of growing our influence. Now, this week, I want us to talk about the second brick. And guys, this brick I'm really excited about. I was excited about last week, but I get excited every week. But this brick I'm excited about because this is the number one thing to grow your influence. I mean, this is the greatest catalyst. If you and I were to sit down and you're like, okay, Buck, I want to experience strength and endurance. I want to experience something better relationally, my career and my faith and so on. What's the number one thing I can do to grow my influence? Well, this is it. So what is it? What is it? Well, to get you thinking, or to get us all thinking, I want to bring your attention to the screen, and I want you to look at this guy right here. Now, this, you may think, that's Mel Gibson, but I don't want you to think that. I want you to think William Wallace. This is William Wallace from the movie Braveheart, and this is my all-time favorite movie. And I'm just out of curious, like, how many of you guys love Braveheart? Any Braveheart fans? Yes. There you go. So I'm not alone. So this is good. So the first time I watched Braveheart, I was in college. And I'm telling you, when I watched the movie, like I felt so inspired. I was like, man, I'm going to go take on the world. I'm going to go change the world. I mean, this is a guy of influence. It was such a cool movie. And in fact, the movie has had some impact on my personal life because there are 2 lines I say from the movie all the time in my family. And I'm going to share those with you, and I'm going to try my best Scottish accent. And I'm the guy who tries to do an accent, and you're like, that doesn't sound anything like it. So I'm preparing you for this. So just give me a lot of grace, right? But here's what I say from the movie, and I say this all the time to Jill. I look at her and I go, babe, I love you. Always have, always will. I had the always will part. Anyways, so that's my first attempt. There we go. Thank you. Who clapped? Just you and I are together. Yeah, thank you. So that's my first thing. The second thing I say my family, and I'm probably like setting my children up for therapy in the future because I say this, but anytime they talk about like death and Dad, I'm scared, and oh my gosh, if I get eaten by a lion, and all this kind of stuff, anytime they talk anything around death, I look at them and I say a line from the movie, and this is verbatim. I look at them and I go, boys, every man dies, but not every man really lives. No claps for that one. Thank you, guys. No. So, like I said, that's a little bit like British and country mixed in together. Who knows what kind of accent that is? But my point in sharing that with you guys is to say, like, the movie itself, it is a fantastic movie. It's my all-time favorite movie. And today I really wanted to teach on the life of William Wallace, but my team was like, hey, Buck, you can't do that. There's only like a poem about his life, so I'm not sure, what we're going to say. But in the movie, he did embody this second brick. And not only did he in the movie, but somebody in history named Nehemiah also embodied this second brick. And in this series, as I said last week, we're looking at the life of Nehemiah and the letter of Nehemiah. Because if you were to ask me, if you were to say, hey, Buck, what's the greatest leadership letter out of the 66 letters in the Bible? Without even flinching, I would say Nehemiah. It's the greatest leadership letter in the Bible. It's fantastic. So many principles, so many awesome concepts on what great leadership looks like. And so we're looking at the life of Nehemiah, we're making some observations, and we're discovering very practical ways to take steps and to grow our influence. So today we're going to look at another story in the life of Nehemiah. And before we jump into that story, I want to catch you up on the historical part, which I shared a little bit of this last week. And if you weren't here last week, this will kind of set the whole story of Nehemiah up. So Nehemiah lived in 444 BC. That's when the story takes place. And Nehemiah was actually the cupbearer to the most powerful man in the world, King Artaxerxes, who was the king of Persia. And as a cupbearer, he was the most trusted guy of King Artaxerxes. I mean, the cupbearer would, taste the food and drink the wine, and if it was poison, they would croak. And so the person that King Artaxerxes trusted his life with was Nehemiah. So you could argue to say he was perhaps one of the most influential people in the most powerful kingdom of the world. That's Nehemiah. Now, here's what's interesting, that Nehemiah, he wasn't Persian. In fact, Nehemiah was born under the Persian Empire, but his ancestors were from Israel. I mean, they were Jewish, they were Israelites. And so as a Jewish kind of Israelite, he grew in the Persian Empire to the point of being perhaps the second most powerful man in the most powerful empire in the world, which is wild to think about. And so that's Nehemiah. And one day, there was something that happened that broke Nehemiah's heart. And what broke his heart is he found out about the city of Jerusalem, which represented the nation of Israel, which represented, the God of Israel, and the people of Israel, who hadn't been a sovereign nation up until that point for about 300 years because they were conquered by, the Assyrians and the Babylonians and so on. He found out that the city was in shambles. The people were more divided and separated than ever before. And he thought to himself, this is what's become of the nation of Israel, and it broke his heart. And so he said, I'm going to do something about it. And so he went before King Artaxerxes, and he was sad. And that's a big deal because in ancient history, you cannot go before a king without being happy. You have to be happy. In fact, if you went before a king in ancient history and you were sad, it could cost you your life. It was punishable by going to the dungeon. I mean, that was it. So he had never done this before. He goes before King Artaxerxes. He's sad. The king notices because he's never seen this before. The king says, what's up, Nehemiah? Nehemiah tells him, hey, my ancestors and my nation, it's in shambles and it's breaking my heart. And King Artaxerxes responds favorably and says, how can I help? And Nehemiah says, well, you can help by giving me some time, resources, supplies, people, and authority, because I want to go back to the city of Jerusalem. The city represents, God, the God of Israel and the nation of Israel. I want to rebuild the city, and I want to rebuild my nation. And rebuilding the city and the nation is no threat to the Persian Empire. It was massive. And so King Artaxerxes gives him everything that he asked for. Makes him the governor of Judea, the whole region, where Jerusalem's located, gives him all the supplies. So he goes to Jerusalem, takes him about 2 months to get there. He finally arrives to the city, and it is far worse than what he had been told. I mean, the walls are just broken and in shambles. The gates still have remnants of Babylon. And when Babylon, torched the city, he looks at the temple, the Solomon's temple that was one of the wonders of the world, and it's just a disgrace. It's a fraction of how Solomon built it. And then he looks at the economy and the morale, and it's completely devastated. And one of the reasons why the economy was devastated is because in that ancient time, in ancient history, what was happening is the non-Jewish people, Gentiles outside the city of Jerusalem, the landowners, money merchants, they were making loans to the people of Israel in their poverty. And they were charging an exorbitant amount of interest to these people. And they were profiting off the backs of the poor. And Nehemiah shows up, and he sees this. And what would happen in ancient times is if you defaulted, you couldn't pay your loan, you couldn't pay these high interest rates, they would take your wife and they would take your children, sell them into slavery to pay back the loan. Then they would take your livestock, your vineyards, and your farms. And all of this was taking place. And Nehemiah shows up, and it's absolute devastation. And he does something that is radical. He does something that's so sacrificial off the bat. He says, I'm going to take my money, not yours. I'm not going to charge you anything for this. I'm going to do this for you. I'm going to take my money, my resources, the things I negotiated with King Artaxerxes. I'm going to pay off every single one of those loans. And he pays off all these high interest loans. He gets their wives back. He gets their children back. He gets their farms. He gets their vineyards. He gets everything back. Can you imagine that? And they're standing there like before this brand new leader going, wow, look at that sacrifice. And then he rallies the people together, and he says, let's do something that hasn't been done in over 100 years. For the last 70 plus years, they've been trying to rebuild the walls. And walls in ancient history represented security, represented honor, represented strength, and allowed them to rebuild their economy. So first and foremost, let's rebuild these walls. And they didn't take 100 years. They took 52 days to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. I mean, this guy, Nehemiah, remarkable, remarkable leader. And so fast forward a couple years. The walls are rebuilt. The economy's being rebuilt. People have their wives and their sons and daughters back. And so you would think times are good. Like things are moving forward. But you would be wrong, perhaps, if you thought that. Because there was something happening. Specifically, there was something happening with the leaders and the nobles and the people with money and wealth in the nation or in the city of Jerusalem. And here's where we pick up the story right there. Nehemiah chapter 5. He says, when I heard their outcry, the people, are giving Nehemiah feedback. They're saying, here's what's going on. When I heard their outcry and these charges of these nobles, I was very angry. So right off the bat, Nehemiah's ticked. I mean, he is hot about something. So you're like, Nehemiah, what are you so ticked about? What did you hear about the nobles? And we learn. Here's what he heard. You nobles, you leaders, Israelite men, you guys, you are charging your own people interest. And we read that in first hearing, we're like, what's the big deal? This is a big deal. Because what Nehemiah knows is that their Bible, if you will, for that Jewish community was called the Torah. And the Torah, it was illegal. It was against the law of God to charge your own people interest on these loans. And they were breaking that law. And they were repeating what the Gentiles had done years earlier. That Nehemiah had spent all of his hard-earned money and all of this sacrifice to repay, or pay off all these loans. Now they're repeating these issues. And they're taking advantage of their own Jewish brothers and sisters, of their own Jewish families. And they're profiting off the backs of the poor. And he's sitting there going, how dare you? What are you guys doing? So he calls them out. And then he says, here's what we're going to do. And so Nehemiah said, I called together a large meeting to deal with them. And here's what he said to these nobles, these people of influence, these people of wealth who were overcharging interest just like the Gentiles. He says, as far as possible, we have bought back our fellow Jews, reminding them of what he's done, who were sold to the Gentiles. And then look at this. Now you are selling your own people, only for them to be sold back to us. You're repeating those same mistakes. And so at this point, they could have pushed on Nehemiah. They could have said, well, Nehemiah, we're taking all the risk here. We're taking our hard-earned money. We're loaning it out. I mean, if you're financially savvy, you understand this, Nehemiah. They could have pushed back on him. But what did they do? They kept quiet, which is a clue to our second brick. Why? Because they could find nothing to say. Well, why didn't they give a defense? I mean, if you're in the financial world, do you understand loaning money to people in poverty? I mean, that's a high risk loan. They're taking all the risk here. They could have pushed logically back on Nehemiah, but they didn't. They stood there silently. And then Nehemiah takes it a step further and says, here's what I'm wanting you to do. He says, give back to them immediately, today, like not tomorrow. Don't go think about it. Right now, give back their fields, vineyards, olive groves, and their houses, and also all the interest you're charging them. And he goes on, 1% of the money, grain, new wine, and olive oil. In other words, nobles, you're going to have to change your lifestyle today. You're going to have to go home and tell your wives, hey, no more second homes. Hey, no more Xboxes for the kids and PlayStations. We're going to sell all those things on Craigslist. We're going to have to make some major sacrifices as a family financially. Because today, we're going to have to give it all back to the people we took it from. That's massive. And the question becomes, did they do it? I mean, because logically speaking, from a financial perspective, they were taking all the risks. They could have easily said to Nehemiah, just, get out of here. This is ridiculous. But here's the thing we have to factor in. When Nehemiah stood before them, these nobles and the people of Israel, he stood before them with two things. Number one, he had positional authority. Because remember, he was the governor of Judea. And we all know what positional authority is. It's authority gained by position. A CEO, a boss, a coach, a teacher, a parent, specifically a parent of like young children, because once they get older, it doesn't feel like you have positional authority, right? But it's positional authority, and people oftentimes obey positional authority because they want their job. They want a paycheck. They want their allowance, or they want to go hang out with their friends. So whatever mom and dad said in their positional authority, I'm going to do. But with positional authority, someone can have positional authority, and you can have zero respect for their position of authority. But Nehemiah not only had positional authority, but he also had moral authority. Because Nehemiah, they knew the story, had been willing to sacrifice his life before King Artaxerxes. It could have cost him his life for the people that he stood before. Nehemiah, when he showed up to the city of Jerusalem, paid off their loans and said, you don't need to pay me back. I'm going to sacrifice what I have coming to me. Like, you owe me all this stuff, but I'm going to do that for something greater, and it's you. You have so much value, I'm going to sacrifice and pay off all your loans and get your wives and children back. Nehemiah spent the time in leadership, the time invested in the people, the time walking the walls, the time to rebuild these walls in 52 days. And Nehemiah was a man of character. What he said is exactly what he did, and what he did is exactly what he said. A man of character. And they saw him call out the injustices that were happening in the community. And that's who stood before them. And so, what'd they do? Well, they didn't have anything to say because he had moral authority. And here's what they ultimately did. The story ends up. And they said, we will give it back, they said, and we will not demand anything more from them. Nehemiah, we will do as you say. Nehemiah was a man who was an incredible leader. This was his brave heart moment. Incredible integrity, incredible moral authority. So, that brings us to our second brick. What is the greatest catalyst to influence? What is the number one thing, if you and I are just talking, that you could have that basically speeds up or gets you to a place to have incredible influence? Well, I would say the number two brick is intelligent, sensible leaders have moral authority. Again, moral authority is that your words match your actions and your actions match your words. Moral authority gives you incredible influence. This is so important, especially if you have influence in anybody's lives, which we all do because we all have influence. Moral authority gives you influence at the deepest levels. If you have positional authority, you can say, hey, do this, do that. Maybe your kids will do it. Maybe an employee will do it. Maybe, if a student will do it, because they want the grade, they want to stay on the team, whatever it is. But moral authority allows you to influence minds, hearts, and conscience. Because Nehemiah stood before the people. And now their conscience bumped into something that they previously didn't bump into. Because they were fine charging all kinds of interest. They were fine with it. But Nehemiah stood before them, a man of authority, a man of influence, a man of moral authority. And now all of a sudden it's lighting up their conscience. See, moral authority can work for you or against you. And moral authority is amazing because, people who have moral authority and may not have positional authority, you actually go to them. You may have a coach, a teacher, a boss that's not your coach or teacher or boss, but you'll go to them and you'll say, hey, there's something in my life going on. Can we talk? Can we talk? So they don't have positional authority, but they have moral authority because you want to say, can you help me with this? Because I see your life and I see the integrity and I see the character and I see the moral authority. Come help me, influence me in life. And we've all seen that. We've all seen, again, a boss, a teacher, a coach who has this incredible moral authority and positional authority. They have great influence on your life. And we've all seen a coach, a teacher, a boss without moral authority. And you'll look at them and you may have even said this. They're my boss, but I don't respect them. They're my teacher, but I have no respect for that teacher because look at the way they talk to people. Look at the way they treat people. Look at the way they take their influence of leadership and they leverage it for their selfish desires. They can have authority, but they do not have my respect. It can work one way or the other. That's also true when it comes to faith, isn't it? Or when it comes to Christianity, the church and church leaders, when it comes to Christians. I mean, you've heard so many stories of people going, I wasn't a Christian, I was out on church, but then, I took a step towards God and I took a step towards Christianity or took a step towards church because I knew this Christian and they weren't weird. Like, they were pretty cool. And because I began to discover the life of this Christian, what they said and what they did, there was consistency and integrity. Wow. And so that's how kind of my foot in the door, that's how I became a Christian because of that person. And you've also heard the opposite. You've heard people have walked away from faith, walked away from the church, walked away from Christianity because they're like, do you see how they talk about people? Do you see what they say about people who disagree with them politically? Do you see how they post those things on social media? And they claim to be a follower of Jesus. I want nothing to do with their God. One of my favorite statements that so pertains to this tension in moral authority is from an old preacher by the name of Gypsy Smith. Isn't that a great name? Imagine introducing yourself. I'm Gypsy. Nice to meet you. That'd be fun. Anyways, Gypsy Smith, an old preacher, he says something I love and I think about all the time. He says, there are 5 gospels. A gospel is a letter about the life of Jesus. Listen carefully. This is so important. He says there's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Then there's you. And most people will never read the first 4 letters about the life of Jesus. They're going to read your words. They're going to read your actions. And they're going to make decisions to pursue or not to pursue the life of Jesus based upon your life, based upon your moral integrity and authority. And not only is that true when it comes to faith, but guys, it's also true when it comes to parenting. Oh my goodness, if you're a parent, if you're here today and you're a parent or you're watching or listening online, you're a parent, please lean in. This is so important. This is how you capture the hearts and the minds and the conscience of your kiddos. Because we can parent with positional authority between ages 0 to 12, size and position. I got size, you're going to do what I say because I'm your parent, I'm your mom, I'm your dad. And as soon as legit, if they're teenagers and you say, you better do what I say because I'm your mom, I'm your dad, at that point, you've lost moral authority. You see, capturing the hearts of our sons and daughters, man, it requires moral authority. And you've all seen this and you've heard the stories. You've heard the stories of, man, I grew up in a home where my dad or my mom, they went to church. God bless everybody. They read the Bible, they prayed. But then I saw the way my mom talked to my dad or my dad talked to my mom. Or then I saw the way they talked about people in our extended family. Then I saw the way they talked about people who disagreed with him politically or maybe on a social issue. And I was like, yeah, that's my mom, that's my dad. But honestly, I don't have a lot of respect. And they don't have a lot of influence in my life because of moral authority. But the opposite is also true. Several years ago, a buddy of mine, a pastor here locally, his youngest son, he was telling me the story, his youngest son was an agnostic. And so he was telling me, just imagine being a pastor and your youngest son is an agnostic. It's just tough. So we were talking about that, and we were, he was giving me the details and all this. And then I talked to one of his friends, one of his son's friends, and his son's friend told me this. He said, the reason why his youngest son is not an atheist, he wants to be an atheist, to say, hey, there's no God, there's nothing, but he's an agnostic to say, hey, there's got to be something. There's got to be something. The only reason he's an agnostic and not an atheist is because of his father. because he's listened to his father on Sundays preach these messages, and he watched him in the home behind closed doors, and there was consistency. He listened to his father talk about marriage, and he saw the way his dad talked to his mom. He listened to his father talk about people outside the faith and outside the church, and he watched his dad love unconditionally people outside the faith and outside the church. And his youngest son says, man, I want to be an atheist, but the only reason I'm agnostic is because I cannot deny the faith of my father. My father has moral authority. You see, if you're a parent, this is a big, big deal. And honestly, it's a big deal for all of us. Because at the end of the day, the greatest thing to grow your influence is moral authority. So the question becomes, how do we get it? As we wrap up, if you and I are just talking, you're like, okay, great. But how do I begin to grow in that? Like, how can I get more moral authority in my life? And I would say 3 specific words. Number 1, character. Character. Now, character, a general statement of character. Character is a willingness to do what's hard, to do the right thing regardless of the cost. And that's character. I'm going to do the right thing, but it could cost me my reputation. It could cost me a position at my company. It could cost me a little bit of finances. But I'm going to do the right thing regardless of the cost. That's character. Now listen carefully. If you are a follower of Jesus, here's how I would describe character. I would define it this way. Doing what love requires of you regardless of the cost. Doing what love requires of you regardless of the cost. Now, this is so important. You see, Jesus gave one command. Jesus gave one command when he said, a new command I give you. And he says, love one another as I have loved you. And again, if you're a follower of Jesus and you and I were just sitting down and you were like, Buck, there's kind of this lackluster, there's a little bit of apathy around Christianity, I would look at you and I'd say, if you want to experience the real adventure of Christianity, if you want to take some risk and really trust God like there's no tomorrow, then just keep this one command. Do what love requires of you. And the standard of that is the life of Jesus Christ. And adventure is on the other side of that decision. I'm telling you, character, doing what love requires of you, regardless of the cost. Do you know what love requires of us and what will build our character? It's to say 3 words that I particularly don't like saying. I am sorry. See, what's important to know, moral authority is not perfection. Moral authority is a humility to say, I'm broken. Man, I'm sorry for that. There was an inconsistency between what I said and what I did. I'm going to own that right away. And the operative word in that is owning. Owning. I'm just telling you, when you've been on the other side of somebody who owns their piece of the pie, in other words, there's a tension, there's a gap relationally, there's a gap in your marriage, there's a gap with whatever, but that person doesn't play the blame game. They don't go, well, if you would, if she would, if they would. They don't keep a list like, hey, here's what I do, here's what you, they're done with that. But the individual who owns their piece of the pie, who looks at, tension and goes, there's my piece of the pie. And then there's an authentic apology where they go, I'm really sorry for the words that I said. Because if someone said those words to me, I would feel lonely. I would feel hurt. And that's exactly what I did to you. And listen, I'm so sorry. And I've got to meet with a friend, I've got to meet with a pastor, I've got to meet with a counselor, because I keep saying this thing, and it keeps causing brokenness between us. Boy, if somebody gives you that kind of authentic apology, which means they're owning their piece of the pie, that goes such a long ways when it comes to character. You know what else love requires of us to do that, maybe we don't want to do, but I'm telling you, it builds character? It's to empty the vault. Empty the vault. Because listen carefully. I don't believe you can have moral authority and maintain secrets. I don't think you can do that. I think you may have 50% of moral authority, maybe 60% of moral authority, but I don't think you can authentically be you while hiding something inside of you. Because there's a lie that oftentimes we buy into, as long as no one knows, everything will be okay. We tell ourselves this over and over and over. Hey, there was this thing I did in spring break. There's this thing I did in college. There's this thing I did 10 years ago, but nobody knows. Because as long as no one knows, everything will be okay. Do you know that's a lie? Because it's not. Because you're carrying that with you. which means it has a lot of energy in here, and you're building up walls to protect that. You can't authentically be you because somebody might find out about that secret. So there's an intimacy gap in your marriage. There's a trust gap, perhaps with the hearts of your sons and daughters. You cannot authentically have moral authority while carrying a secret. And here's the deal. I know perhaps what you say right now. Buck, I cannot tell the secret. I cannot disclose that because the consequence would be too great. And I understand that. I mean, I'm on the other side of my boys all the time. And, as a parent, you would relate with this where you're like, okay, what happened? What happened? What's going on? What's going on? And, the initial response, nothing. I'm fine. Nothing. I'm fine. You're like, come on. Just trust me. Don't take that by yourself. Don't take that to bed. Just be honest. And then finally, it's like, deep inside, they're like, okay, here it is, Dad. Oh. And they get it out, and there's so much shame. And I'm the dad, you're going to be so mad at me. And when I see my sons do that, one of the first things I try to say is, I'm so glad you told me. And I respect you now more in this moment than before, because I know how hard it is to get that out. And you're my son. And I remind them of who they are. Guys, I get the fear of emptying the vault, of disclosing the secret, maybe to a counselor, maybe to a pastor, maybe to a mentor or a trusted friend. But I would suggest there's a greater fear. And I think the greater fear of the immediate consequence, I think there's a greater fear of not experiencing intimacy in your marriage, not experiencing what Jesus talks about, this oneness that you can experience in your marriage because you're carrying around something in your vault. I would suggest the greater fear is perhaps not engaging in building trust with the heart of your son or daughter or sons and daughters for decades and decades and decades. That's a greater fear. And I think maybe the short-term instability that's created because of disclosing this will create a long-term intimacy that you desire in your life. And when we do it, and we get on the other side of a counselor, somebody trusted, and we're like, here it is, can you help me walk through this? I'm telling you, it's a giant step towards character, which is a giant step towards moral authority. The last two, and I'll go through these quick. Not only is character, but sacrifice. Sacrifice is saying, I'm willing to give up what somebody owes me for something greater than me. That's important to hear. I'm willing to give up something that someone owes me or that I deserve for something greater than me. I'm willing to give up some time. This week I worked hard. I've got time on the weekend, right? I deserve that time, but I'm willing to give that up because God called me to something greater. Because there's something beyond me that I'm going to serve as a small group leader. I'm going to serve in guest services. I'm going to go serve the community and be for Austin. Because Jesus said, I didn't come to serve, but I came to give my life as a ransom for many. I came to serve, not to be served. That's greater than me. See, it's a sacrifice to give of your time. Same thing is true with money. I mean, you worked hard. You used the talents God's given you. You've been responsible. You got money coming your way. You're owed money, right? And it's a sacrifice to give. But to give is motivated when Jesus says things like this, do not store for yourself up treasure on earth, but store for yourself treasure in heaven. Like, trust me. Trust me. And when we look to something beyond ourselves to make disciples, to advance the kingdom of God and go, hey, I'm going to go ahead and sacrifice. I mean, that's a big deal. And do you know what else is sacrifice? Forgiveness. Forgiveness. I'm telling you, forgiveness, when you get to the end of forgiveness, what you discover as you walk through the process of forgiveness, you discover they owe you something. That's what forgiveness is all about. He did something. She did something. They owe me something. And then what you discover at the end of forgiveness is they can't pay the debt. You can't go back to when you were 10 years old. You can't go back to 10 years ago, 5 years ago, 5 days ago. They can't fully repay the debt, which means you're going to have to cancel the debt. They owe you, but you're going to have to give them something that they owe you. You're going to have to give them forgiveness. And that's got to come from outside of you, to do what God has done for you and to forgive as the Lord forgave you, and is to ultimately come to the conclusion, you don't owe me. And then the key to know you've forgiven is to turn the lights off, to lock the door, to throw away the key, and don't you dare bring it up again, or you need to go back to forgiveness. That's a sacrifice, but it frees you. And when you forgive, it's a giant step towards moral authority. Last of all, time. And if I could push a button, I would for all of us to speed this up, to gain moral authority, because it just leads to influence. But the reality is this is going to take time. It's small deposits of character. It's small deposits of sacrifice over time that leads to moral authority. So guys, this is what Nehemiah had. Nehemiah had moral authority. And when we step into this, it provides, it's the greatest catalyst for us to experience moral authority. And when we step in and have moral authority, intelligent, sensible leadership, it gives us strength, it gives us endurance in our marriages, with our relationships with our kids, with our friends, in dating relationships, with our career. It strengthens our faith. And listen, you may hear that and you may go, well, that's preacher talk, Buck. That's just cute stuff to say. That's just trying to motivate me to do something better or whatever, but you don't know the story. And you're right. I don't know the story, but here's what I do know. That's not cute preacher talk. Guys, this is real. You can really experience something different in your life. You can take a giant step into the adventure of life. The things that your heart, your soul longs for, it's possible. It really is possible for all of us to do that. But it is going to require something of us. And what it's going to require of us is to take a step into moral authority. Let me pray for us. Father, thank you so much for this moment that we can have these kind of discussions, to talk about things that are so incredibly important, to laugh about some goofy things, and also to hear some things that ultimately allow us to take a step and experience what you have for us. God, I understand the complexities of a discussion like this and that we're all at different spaces in different places. So, Father, would you meet all of us this day and this week and help us take a step into your plans and experience strength and endurance. I trust you with that in Jesus' name. Amen. Guys, thanks again for being here. I'll see you next week.